The movie starts with a scene where a crow is perched on an old sign that says "Private Road." Then a black SUV passes by with 5 people inside. Chris is the one driving, and Johnny is in the front seat. They talk about their plans for the summer. The other people in the back seat are sleeping. They are Scott, Brian, and Natalie. Suddenly, some crows hit the windshield of the car, and the SUV veers off the road, heading into a cornfield. Shortly after, everyone in the car wakes up, but Johnny is nowhere to be found. While searching for Johnny, Scott tries to find a signal on his cell phone, but it doesn't work. Brian sees an opening in the cornfield and thinks that Johnny might have gone in that direction. Meanwhile, Brian suggests he could go back to the gas station, but before he can leave, Scott sees a house in the distance through the cornfield and believes Johnny might have gone there. So, Brian and Scott start walking through the cornfield toward the house, while Natalie and Chris stay with the SUV and have a small snack. Scott is getting tired because he is not as fit as Brian. As they walk, they talk, but Brian begins to think they might be going in the wrong direction. They come across an old mailbox and an abandoned car in the cornfield. Scott finds an area where the corn is flattened and appears to have a dead animal on the ground. Brian is examining the car when Scott calls him. Scott has found a scarecrow tied to a wooden post. He climbs on the post to see where they are and says the scarecrow is stinking. Scott can see the distant house and notices a light turning on in the window upstairs. Meanwhile, back at the SUV, Chris grabs a flashlight from the glove compartment while Natalie takes some pills. She goes to check a sign in the cornfield and, while reading it, sees a boy hiding in the corn. Watching her, the boy runs away. Brian and Scott arrive at the house. Brian goes ahead and knocks on the door. It opens, and they enter to explore. The house appears empty and messy. They hear a noise coming from upstairs as the sun begins to set. Natalie searches along the road, looking through the cornfield for the boy. Natalie discovers a scarecrow fallen on the ground, and when she looks closer, she finds human teeth, which frightens her. She screams, and Chris rushes to comfort her as she heads back to the SUV. Chris takes a quick look at the scarecrow. Natalie expresses her desire to go look for Brian. Chris grabs the flashlight and goes after Natalie through the cornfield. Meanwhile, in the house, Brian and Scott go upstairs. Brian opens a door and they enter a room where the walls are covered in blood stains. In the corner of the room, they see someone using a sewing machine. They realize it is Johnny, who is in a strange state, covered in blood and looking like a zombie. Johnny has nails driven through his fingers and is sewing a scarecrow mask made of burlap. Johnny stops sewing and lifts the mask, but then collapses over the sewing machine and the light goes out. Meanwhile, Natalie arrives at the mailbox in the car. She hears something in the cornfield and begins to feel frightened. Something passes her by several times, causing her injury each time. Chris and Brian hear her scream and run to help her. Chris arrives first and sees her, but she is pulled away. He goes after her, but accidentally collides with Brian. At that moment, the sun is almost setting, and Scott stays outside the house as night falls. Brian and Chris discover Natalie hanging upside down on a wooden cross covered in blood. Brian runs to her and tries to hold her, but a rope at her feet pulls her upward. Brian investigates who might be pulling the rope, but he cannot find anyone. Meanwhile, Chris hears voices and Natalie's eyes begin to shine. He runs through the corn while Brian cuts the ropes holding Natalie. Chris returns to the house through the corn and meets Scott. Chris warns that someone is chasing them and they need to escape. Brian grabs Natalie and runs through the corn, being pursued. When he stops, a scarecrow grabs the ropes still attached to Natalie and pulls her away. Brian chases the scarecrow holding onto Natalie and knocks it down. The scarecrow remains motionless, and another scarecrow pushes Brian onto his back and looms over him, staring into his face for a few moments before running off with Natalie. Brian hurts his shoulder in the struggle. He runs back to the house and meets Scott outside. A scarecrow tries to grab them but doesn't leave the cornfield. While Chris explores the house, Scott goes back upstairs to the sewing room and notices that Johnny is no longer there. Chris mentions that they are surrounded by the cornfield. Scott suggests going back to the SUV, but Chris believes they are trapped. Brian is upset with Chris for not staying to help Natalie. Brian peeks through the window, grabs a flashlight, and along with Scott, decides to leave. As they explore the clearing, Scott sees a scarecrow in the cornfield. Meanwhile, Chris continues searching the house, looking at old family photos on the wall. He tries to use the phone, but finds out it's not working. Outside, around the house, Brian and Scott inspect some cars to see if any are functional. They search for keys, but the cars are full of cobwebs and have broken windows. However, they find a well-maintained Chevy but can't locate the keys. While searching in the garage, Brian discovers some rifle bullets in a box, and Scott notices a scarecrow lying on a workbench. He examines it up close, and suddenly, the thing grabs him frantically. Brian helps him up, but doesn't notice the attack. When Scott stands up, he seems to have a vision in broad daylight. Scott witnesses a farmer teaching his son Alex how to dismember a pig. Suddenly, the farmer looks in Scott's direction and approaches him, but simply walks past him and scolds his other son, Corey, instructing him to take over the task. Corey looks at Alex with envy in his eyes. Brian manages to wake Scott from his trance. Chris discovers some car keys inside the house. Turning around, he notices a figure in the doorway watching him. The figure quickly flees, and Chris chases it, holding a knife. He runs up the stairs and locks himself in the sewing room. In the dim light, he uses his lighter to see, but suddenly the light in the room turns on, scaring him and making him drop the lighter. Looking out the window, Chris sees someone entering the house and calls for Brian and Scott. The door to the sewing room opens, revealing a lifeless Natalie covered in blood, sitting at the sewing machine. The door slams shut behind her. Brian and Scott return to the house. Scott calls for Chris, but the door won't open. Inside, Natalie is painfully hammering nails into her fingers. Scott explains that the door is locked from the inside. Brian tries to force the door open, desperately calling for Natalie while she begins to sew. Brian runs down, while Scott instructs Chris to climb out the window to the roof. Chris lifts the window to escape. When Chris is hanging from the window, Natalie stops sewing and stares in his direction. The window slips from his hand, breaking his fingers, and he falls to the floor, losing consciousness. Brian returns with an axe and runs upstairs to the sewing room, but Natalie has disappeared. Brian screams in frustration. Eventually, Chris wakes up to find himself surrounded by Brian and Scott. Brian insists on knowing where Natalie is, and Chris reluctantly states that she is dead. Scott intervenes to calm the situation and suggests they leave. Chris found the keys to the Chevy, but Brian refuses to go without Natalie and takes Chris's keys. Scott leaves and has another vision. He sees Corey in the cornfield waving for him to follow. Suddenly, it becomes clear, and Scott follows Corey toward a scarecrow. Alex is inspecting the scarecrow when Corey violently stabs him several times with a pitchfork. Scott veers out of his line of sight, finding himself back in the cornfield at night with a rope around his legs. He is pulled up on a wooden cross and calls for Brian and Chris as the scarecrow approaches. It caresses his face with its nail-covered fingers and then injures Scott. The scarecrow falls to the ground when Brian arrives with an axe and knocks it down. They make their way back to the house while Chris searches for a bandage. Scott describes his vision. Brian arms himself with a weapon while Chris tries to convince Scott to escape, but Scott decides to stay with Brian, and they both descend together into the basement. While searching, Scott has another vision of a horrible creature attacking him. Brian manages to calm Scott down, but they then come across a corpse in front of them holding a rifle, which Brian quickly takes. Meanwhile, Chris connects the electricity to the Chevy and drives it through the cornfield. Brian collects the rifle bullets from the garage just as Chris collides with a wooden cross. The car refuses to start, and there's a scarecrow lying on the hood. Chris tries to open the driver's door, but it's stuck, so he climbs over to the passenger side. Another scarecrow breaks the passenger window. Chris manages to kick it out, but the scarecrow on the hood breaks its head through the windshield to get in. Chris removes its mask, and it stops moving, revealing that it's Johnny. Brian arrives and helps Chris out of the car, urging him to run. He aims the rifle at the other scarecrow but hesitates, thinking it might be Natalie. He asks her to say something as she approaches, but she attacks him, and Brian ends up wrestling on the ground. Scott has another daytime vision. Corey emerges from the cornfield and enters the sewing room, where he makes the scarecrow mask. The farmer asks about his brother, but Corey remains silent. Corey returns to Alex, puts the mask on his face, and hangs him on the cross, disguising him as a scarecrow. As night falls, Scott stays outside in front of the house. Chris returns and shares what happened with Scott. Scott wonders why they weren't attacked when they first crossed the corn, and speculates that while one person is being transformed into a scarecrow, no one else can be attacked. Suddenly, Brian enters the room in a zombified state, heading for the sewing room. Chris determines this must end. Scott goes back to the garage to fetch fuel, while Chris tries to recover his lighter from under the sewing machine. As Brian continues his work, Chris is on the floor. Brian suddenly stops working and stares at him. Chris quickly grabs the lighter and runs. Brian continues his task while Scott waits outside for Chris. When they reunite, they run through the cornfield, pouring fuel behind them until they reach the Chevy. Chris is searching for the shotgun, and Brian finishes his sewing task just as the lights go out. A scarecrow lunges at Scott, but Chris manages to find the shotgun and shoots at the scarecrow. They keep running through the corn, shooting at the scarecrows along the way. Upon reaching the mailbox, they start to wonder why the scarecrows suddenly stopped. Brian runs out of the house, and Scott and Chris decide to split up since they can't pursue Brian and the scarecrows at the same time. They agree to meet on the road. In a shocking twist, Chris tries to shoot Brian, but Brian lunges at him, pushing him onto a stake that impales him. Brian then rises behind Chris and launches a new attack, cutting into his body. Chris manages to remove Brian's mask, causing him to collapse. Scott keeps running, pouring fuel and trying to light it. However, the lighter doesn't work. A scarecrow captures Scott, binds his legs with rope, and drags him back through the cornfield, where the scarecrow attacks Chris in his desperate situation. Scott remembers his vision of Corey hitting Alex and searches for a pitchfork. Scott uses the pitchfork to stab the attacking scarecrow, but the scarecrow manages to drag him back. Chris, in a final act of bravery, grabs the scarecrow and urges Scott to run. Tragically, the scarecrow kills Chris with the pitchfork. Scott finally reaches the road and sees a car approaching near the SUV. Despite his desperate attempt to attract the attention of the new victims, he remains unable to do so. A couple arrives to inspect the wrecked SUV, and as they do so, a scarecrow emerges from the cornfield and lays between Scott and the SUV. The man suddenly spots Scott and approaches to offer help, but Scott can't call out and warn him.